Samuel Carter always felt like a ghost searching for its body. At 25, he donated blood at a community drive in Atlanta, believing it was just another way to fill the emptiness with purpose. Then the call came, a DNA match that would shatter the architecture of his solitude. He had a twin brother, a mirror he never knew existed. Michael, adopted into a different world, carried the same face, the same absence. Two lives built on the foundation of incompleteness suddenly faced the unbearable truth. They were never meant to be alone. Subscribe to witness how blood reveals what memory buried. Samuel Carter stood in the parking lot of the community center on a Saturday morning that felt indistinguishable from every other Saturday morning he had known in his 25 years of existence. The sky hung low and gray above Atlanta, pressing down with the weight of another season turning, another year dissolving into the next without ceremony or witness. He had woken that morning in his small apartment on the edge of Midtown with the same sensation he always carried, a peculiar hollowness that lived just beneath his ribs, a space that no amount of routine or distraction could fill. He had learned not to name it, not to examine it too closely, because to acknowledge the absence was to risk drowning in questions that had no answers. Instead, he moved through his days with quiet efficiency, building a life from the scraps of normalcy that others seemed to inherit effortlessly. The blood drive had been announced weeks earlier, posted on flyers throughout the neighborhood, and shared across social media feeds that Samuel scrolled through with detached interest. He had seen the appeals before, urgent calls for donations, reminders that a single pint could save lives, photographs of smiling recipients holding signs of gratitude. Something about this particular drive had caught his attention, though he could not articulate why. Perhaps it was the timing, arriving in his inbox on a Tuesday evening when the silence of his apartment felt particularly oppressive. Perhaps it was the notion of giving something from within himself, of allowing a piece of his blood to travel into another body and sustain a stranger's existence. There was a strange intimacy to it, a connection that transcended words and identities, and Samuel found himself marking the date on his calendar with a sense of purpose that surprised him. He had arrived early, before the line formed, before the volunteers finished arranging the cots and preparing the equipment. The community center smelled of antiseptic and coffee, fluorescent lights humming overhead with a persistent electrical drone. Samuel checked in at the front table, filling out forms with practiced handwriting, answering the standard questions about travel history and health conditions. The woman behind the desk smiled at him with professional warmth, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and Samuel returned the expression automatically, aware that he was performing the gestures of connection without truly feeling them. He had become skilled at this, mirroring the emotional language of others, offering the appropriate responses that allowed him to move through social spaces without drawing attention to the distance he maintained from genuine intimacy. The phlebotomist who called his name was a middle-aged man with graying temples and gentle hands that moved with the confidence of decades of repetition. Samuel settled onto the cot, extending his arm, watching as the tourniquet tightened around his bicep and the vein rose obediently beneath his skin. The needle slid in with a sharp pinch, and then the blood began to flow, dark and viscous, traveling through the clear tube into the collection bag. Samuel watched the process with detached fascination, observing the way his body surrendered this essential fluid without protest, without any sense of loss. The phlebotomist made small talk, questions about his work, comments about the weather, observations about the turnout for the drive, and Samuel responded with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to navigate conversations while revealing nothing of substance. When the bag was full, the phlebotomist pressed gauze to the puncture site and instructed Samuel to apply pressure, to sit for a few minutes and drink some juice before leaving. Samuel obeyed, moving to the recovery area where other donors sat munching cookies and sipping from small plastic cups. He felt lighter somehow, though he knew the loss of blood was negligible, that his body would replace what had been taken within days. The lightness was psychological, a brief reprieve from the weight he carried constantly. He stayed longer than necessary, watching the stream of donors arrive and depart, each one participating in this collective act of anonymous generosity. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine his blood traveling into someone else's veins, mingling with their cells, becoming part of their survival. It was the closest he had ever come to feeling connected to another human being. Samuel left the community center as the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the parking lot. He walked to his car with his hands in his pockets, the bandage on his arm hidden beneath his sleeve. The day stretched ahead of him, empty, unstructured, offering no demands or expectations. He would return to his apartment, perhaps read for a while, perhaps work on the freelance design project that was due Monday. The routine would continue, as it always did, carrying him forward through time, without destination or purpose. He did not expect anything to change. He had long since stopped expecting change. The architecture of his life was built on absence, on the foundation of questions he would never ask and answers he would never receive. He had learned to live within those parameters, to make peace with the incompleteness that defined him. As he drove home through the familiar streets of Atlanta, Samuel could not have known that the blood he had given would become the bridge to everything he had lost, the key to a door he never knew existed. 3 weeks passed in the ordinary rhythm of Samuel's existence, each day folding into the next with the seamless monotony he had cultivated as a form of protection. He worked at his computer, designing logos and websites for small businesses that contracted his services, delivering polished products on time, and collecting payments that kept his rent paid and his refrigerator stocked with modest provisions. His evenings were spent reading, mostly. Novels about other people's lives, biographies of individuals who had carved meaning from circumstance. Philosophy texts that attempted to answer questions about purpose and identity. He read voraciously, as though somewhere in the accumulation of words and ideas he might find the missing piece that would make him whole. But the books only ever provided temporary respite, brief windows into worlds where connection seemed natural and belonging appeared effortless. The phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon while Samuel was reviewing mock-ups for a client's new branding campaign. The number was unfamiliar, and he almost let it go to voicemail, his default response to unexpected contact. But something compelled him to answer, some inexplicable instinct that overrode his habitual caution. The voice on the other end was professional, but warm, introducing herself as Dr. Patricia Henderson from the Atlanta Regional Blood Bank. Samuel's first thought was that something had gone wrong with his donation, that perhaps his blood had tested positive for some disease he didn't know he carried. His chest tightened as he listened, preparing himself for bad news, for another complication in a life that already felt sufficiently complicated by its inherent emptiness. But Dr. Henderson's words took an entirely different direction, one that Samuel's mind struggled to process even as she spoke them clearly and carefully. During the routine screening of his donation, his DNA had been entered into a database, a standard procedure, she explained, used to match donors with recipients and to maintain medical records. What was not standard was what the database had revealed. There had been a match, not with a recipient, but with another donor whose blood had been collected and processed through the same system months earlier. The match was not partial or distant, but complete and unmistakable. According to the genetic markers, Samuel had a biological sibling, a twin brother. The words seemed to arrive from a great distance, filtered through layers of disbelief that Samuel's consciousness erected almost immediately. A twin brother. The concept was absurd, impossible. contradicting everything he had understood about his own history. He had grown up in foster care after being surrendered to the state as an infant, moving through a series of temporary homes that never solidified into permanence. The file he had eventually obtained at 18 had been sparse: a single mother who could not care for him, no father listed, no mention of siblings. He had been alone from the beginning, a singular entity navigating a world that seemed designed for pairs and groups and families. The idea that someone else shared his exact genetic code, that another person carried the same biological blueprint, felt like a fiction too elaborate to believe. Dr. Henderson continued speaking, her voice steady and reassuring, explaining the protocols and procedures, asking if Samuel would be willing to be contacted by the other individual. She emphasized that this was voluntary, that he had every right to decline, to maintain his privacy and continue with his life undisturbed. But even as she spoke, Samuel felt something shifting inside him, some tectonic movement in the landscape of his identity. The hollowness he had carried for so long suddenly had context, a possible explanation that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He heard himself agreeing to the contact, providing permission for his information to be shared, his voice sounding strange and unfamiliar in his own ears. Dr. Henderson thanked him, mentioned that she would facilitate the initial communication, and ended the call with professional courtesy. Samuel sat motionless at his desk for a long time after hanging up, staring at the screen without seeing the design elements displayed there. His mind raced through possibilities and implications, constructing and deconstructing scenarios with frantic energy. A twin brother meant separation, meant choices made before he had consciousness or agency. It meant that the narrative he had built about his solitary origin was fundamentally incorrect. Somewhere in the world, another person existed who shared his face, his genetic history, his cellular composition. The thought was overwhelming, threatening to crack open the carefully maintained composure he had developed over years of self-reliance. He wanted to feel excitement or joy or some recognizable emotion that matched the magnitude of the revelation. Instead, he felt vertigo, as though the ground beneath him had suddenly revealed itself to be far less solid than he had believed. That night, Samuel lay awake in his bed, watching shadows move across the ceiling as headlights from passing cars swept through his window. He thought about the concept of twins, about stories he had read of siblings separated at birth who found each other decades later and discovered uncanny similarities in their lives. Same professions, same preferences, same unconscious gestures. He wondered what his brother was like, whether they would recognize something fundamental in each other, or whether the years of separate development would have created two entirely different people who happened to share DNA. The questions multiplied endlessly, spiraling into the early hours of morning, and Samuel realized with sudden clarity that he had been waiting his entire life for this moment without knowing it. The absence he had carried was not metaphorical or psychological, it was literal. Something had been missing, someone had been missing, and now, impossibly, that someone had a name, an existence, a reality that was about to collide with his own. The email arrived 2 days later, appearing in Samuel's inbox with a subject line that was both simple and profound: "From your brother." Samuel stared at the words for several minutes before opening the message, his cursor hovering over the text as though the act of clicking might irrevocably alter the trajectory of his existence. He had spent the intervening days in a state of suspended animation, unable to focus on work, unable to settle into the routines that usually provided structure and stability. His mind returned obsessively to the phone call, to Dr. Henderson's calm voice delivering information that seemed designed to unravel everything he thought he knew about himself. Now the moment had arrived. Contact from the other half of an equation he had never realized existed. The email was written with careful consideration, each sentence revealing both eagerness and caution. Michael introduced himself as Michael Bennett, 25 years old, living in Savannah, Georgia, just a few hours south of Atlanta. He had been adopted as an infant by a couple named Robert and Linda Bennett, raised as an only child in a comfortable suburban home with loving parents who had given him every advantage they could afford. He described his shock upon receiving the call from Dr. Henderson, the disbelief that had given way to curiosity and then to an urgent need to make contact. He wrote about always feeling that something was slightly off, a persistent sense of incompleteness that he had attributed to adoption trauma or some other psychological quirk. Now he understood it differently. He had been incomplete because he was literally half of something whole. Michael's words carried an emotional vulnerability that Samuel found both moving and unsettling. He wrote about the questions he had asked his adoptive parents, the tearful conversations that had revealed what they knew, that he had been adopted through a private agency, that the birth mother had surrendered him along with another infant, that the babies had been placed separately according to agency policy at the time. Robert and Linda had never known about the twin, had been told only that their son had come from difficult circumstances and that they were giving him a chance at a better life. They had been supportive of Michael's decision to reach out, encouraging him to explore this connection, understanding that it filled a void they had tried but failed to address throughout his childhood. The email included a photograph attached at the end. Michael standing in front of what appeared to be a beach, the ocean stretching behind him in shades of blue and grey. Samuel downloaded the image with trembling fingers, watching as the pixels resolved into a face that was simultaneously foreign and intimately familiar. The resemblance was undeniable, almost uncanny. The same dark hair with the slight wave at the temples, the same angular jawline, the same deep-set eyes that carried an expression of thoughtful observation. There were differences, too. Michael's smile was broader, more confident, his posture more open and relaxed. He looked like someone who had grown up with security and affirmation, while Samuel recognized in his own reflection the guarded wariness of someone who had learned to protect himself from disappointment. Samuel read and reread the email throughout the evening, absorbing the details of Michael's life. His work as a high school history teacher, his love of running and photography, his close relationship with his adoptive parents, his recent engagement to a woman named Claire who taught at the same school. It was a life that seemed full and purposeful, populated with connections and commitments that Samuel had never managed to cultivate. He felt a complex mixture of emotions rising within him: envy for the stability Michael had known, gratitude that at least one of them had been spared the chaos of the foster system, and beneath it all, a profound longing to know this person who carried the same genetic code. The longing was different from anything he had experienced before, more primal and urgent, as though his body recognized what his mind was still struggling to accept. Composing a response took Samuel hours, each attempt feeling inadequate to the weight of the moment. He wanted to sound open, but not desperate, curious, but not demanding, authentic, but not overwhelming. He settled finally on honesty, describing his own life with straightforward simplicity. The foster homes, the eventual independence, the solitary career, the apartment in Atlanta. He acknowledged the strangeness of the situation, the surreal quality of discovering a sibling at 25, and admitted that he didn't know exactly what he was feeling, but that he wanted to know more. He suggested meeting in person if Michael was willing, perhaps somewhere halfway between their two cities. He attached his own photograph, a recent snapshot taken by a colleague at a coffee shop, nothing staged or formal, just Samuel looking directly at the camera with the faint suggestion of a smile. When he pressed send, Samuel felt the same vertiginous sensation he had experienced during Dr. Henderson's call, as though he were stepping off a ledge into unknown territory. The email disappeared into the digital void, and Samuel sat back in his chair, suddenly exhausted by the emotional labor of the past few days. Outside his window, the city continued its endless motion, indifferent to the quiet revolution occurring in his small apartment. He thought about Michael in Savannah, perhaps checking his email at this very moment, reading Samuel's words and forming impressions and making decisions about how to proceed. For the first time in his life, Samuel felt accountable to another person in a way that transcended obligation or duty. This was blood calling to blood, recognition seeking recognition, and whatever happened next would reshape the architecture of his entire existence. They agreed to meet on a Saturday morning at a coffee shop in Macon, a city positioned almost exactly halfway between Atlanta and Savannah, neutral territory where neither of them held familiarity or advantage. Samuel woke before dawn that day, his body humming with an anxiety that was both exhilarating and nauseating. He showered with deliberate slowness, trying to calm the racing thoughts that had kept him awake most of the night. What would they talk about? How would it feel to stand face to face with someone who shared his exact features? Would there be instant connection? Or would the decades of separate experience create an unbridgeable gulf between them? The questions spiraled without resolution as he dressed carefully, choosing clothes that felt authentic but not careless, wanting to present himself honestly without overthinking the performance. The drive south took just under 2 hours, the highway cutting through rural Georgia landscape that shifted from urban sprawl to pine forests and small towns that seemed preserved from another era. Samuel drove with the radio off, preferring silence to distraction, his mind cycling through possible scenarios and conversations. He had memorized Michael's photograph, studying the contours of that familiar, strange face until he could reconstruct it from memory. The resemblance was profound, yes, but what did that mean in practical terms? Biology was not destiny. Genetics did not determine personality or values, or the content of one's interior life. They might look alike and feel nothing, might discover that shared DNA was insufficient foundation for genuine connection. Samuel tried to manage his expectations, to protect himself from potential disappointment, but beneath the caution, hope flickered with stubborn persistence. The coffee shop was a small, independent establishment on a quiet street lined with brick storefronts and old oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. Samuel arrived 15 minutes early and sat in his car, watching the entrance, practicing deep breathing techniques he had learned years ago during a particularly difficult stretch in his early 20s. At exactly 10 o'clock, a silver sedan pulled into the parking lot, and Samuel's entire body tensed with recognition even before the driver emerged. Michael stepped out of the car with athletic grace, taller than Samuel had imagined. Though they were likely the same height, Michael's confident posture made him seem more substantial. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt, with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and as he turned toward the coffee shop entrance, Samuel saw his own face reflected back at him across the distance. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They stood perhaps 20 feet apart, separated by asphalt and air, and 25 years of divergent experience, simply staring at each other with expressions of wonder and disbelief. Samuel felt his breath catch in his chest, felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding of himself. This was not looking into a mirror. Mirrors reversed and distorted, created illusions of symmetry. This was seeing himself as others saw him, as he existed in the external world, and the experience was profoundly disorienting. Michael's face registered the same shock, the same struggle to process the impossible made real. Then, almost simultaneously, they both started walking toward each other, closing the distance with steps that grew faster and more urgent until they met in the middle of the parking lot. They stood facing each other for several seconds without speaking, searching each other's features with hungry intensity. Up close, the differences became more apparent. A small scar above Michael's left eyebrow, a slightly different angle to the nose, subtle variations in the way they held their mouths, but the fundamental structure was identical, undeniable proof of their shared origin. Michael spoke first, his voice slightly deeper than Samuel's, but with the same cadence and rhythm. He said simply, "I can't believe this is real." And Samuel heard his own bewilderment reflected in those words. They laughed then, awkward and uncertain, the laughter breaking some of the tension that had built like static electricity between them. Michael extended his hand for a formal handshake, then seemed to reconsider and pulled Samuel into an embrace instead, brief but genuine, an acknowledgement of connection that transcended social convention. Inside the coffee shop, they settled at a corner table away from the few other Saturday morning customers, ordering drinks they barely touched, as they began the impossible task of condensing 2.5 decades into coherent narrative. Michael spoke easily, his natural charisma evident in the way he constructed stories and made connections, painting a picture of a childhood filled with stability and affection. He described his adoptive parents with obvious love, emphasizing that they had given him everything a child could need, that he harbored no resentment or sense of abandonment. But he also acknowledged the persistent feeling that something was missing, a vague dissatisfaction that had followed him through adolescence and into adulthood, manifesting as restlessness and a tendency toward isolation even within his loving family. Samuel listened with intense focus, recognizing echoes of his own experience in Michael's description, though the contexts were entirely different. He shared his own history with more difficulty, the words coming slower, weighted with years of practiced self-protection. He spoke about the foster system, the series of homes that ranged from merely indifferent to actively harmful, the constant displacement that had taught him to expect impermanence. He described the loneliness that had defined his childhood, the sense of being fundamentally different from others, unable to form the attachments that seemed to come naturally to his peers. As he spoke, he watched Michael's face register pain and compassion, saw tears gathering in eyes that were mirror images of his own. The conversation continued for hours, time dissolving as they traded stories and compared experiences, discovering both remarkable similarities and stark contrasts, weaving together a narrative that had been torn apart at birth. Over the following weeks, Samuel and Michael developed a rhythm of communication that felt both natural and miraculous. They spoke on the phone nearly every evening, long conversations that stretched past midnight as they excavated the details of their separate lives and searched for patterns that might explain the invisible thread that had always connected them. They discovered strange coincidences. Both had chosen careers that involved visual thinking and communication. Both preferred solitude to large social gatherings. Both had a particular aversion to mushrooms and a love of thunderstorms. These similarities felt significant, evidence of some genetic predisposition that transcended environment. Though Samuel knew intellectually that such connections might be coincidence or confirmation bias, the human tendency to find meaning in random correspondence. Michael suggested they take a DNA test through one of the commercial ancestry services, wanting official confirmation beyond the blood bank database, wanting to see the genetic breakdown that would prove their relationship with scientific certainty. Samuel agreed, ordering the kits and following the instructions to provide saliva samples that would be analyzed and compared. The waiting period felt interminable, though it was only a matter of weeks before the results arrived. Samuel opened his on a quiet Sunday morning, logging into the account and navigating to the relative finder feature. There, highlighted at the top of the list with a confidence percentage of 99.9%, was Michael Bennett, identified as identical twin. Samuel stared at the screen for a long time, feeling something settle deep within him, a piece of truth that made the world suddenly make more sense. They arranged another meeting, this time in Atlanta, where Michael wanted to see the city where Samuel lived and walk through the spaces that had shaped his brother's daily existence. Samuel prepared his apartment with uncharacteristic attention to detail, aware that he was presenting his life for judgment, wanting Michael to understand the context that had formed him. When Michael arrived on a Friday evening, carrying a weekend bag and wearing an expression of excited curiosity, Samuel felt the same vertiginous sensation of unreality that had accompanied their first meeting. They walked through the neighborhood together, Samuel pointing out landmarks, the library where he spent countless hours reading, the coffee shop where he sometimes worked, the park where he ran early mornings when insomnia made sleep impossible. Michael absorbed everything with visible interest, asking questions about Samuel's routines and preferences, trying to understand the architecture of a life built in isolation. That evening, they cooked dinner together in Samuel's small kitchen, moving around each other with surprising coordination, anticipating each other's movements in ways that suggested some deeper synchronization. Over pasta and wine, the conversation turned more serious, addressing the questions they had both been avoiding. Why had they been separated? What had their birth mother's circumstances been that led her to surrender both children? Was it possible to find her, to understand the choices that had set them on such different trajectories? Samuel had already done preliminary research, contacting the adoption agency that had facilitated Michael's placement and requesting information about his own surrender to the state system. The process was complicated, involving sealed records and privacy laws designed to protect all parties. But with both twins requesting information and providing consent, certain doors became accessible. They learned that their birth mother had been 17 at the time of their birth, alone and without resources, facing impossible choices. She had wanted them placed together, but had been advised against it by the agency, told that finding a family willing to adopt infant twins was significantly harder than placing them separately. She had signed the papers with the understanding that they would both have better chances at stable homes if they were separated. The information landed with complex emotional weight. Samuel felt anger at the system that had made such decisions, grief for the teenage girl who had faced unimaginable circumstances, and a renewed awareness of the fragility of the paths that had brought him and Michael to this moment. Michael expressed similar feelings, his voice thick with emotion as they talked late into the night. They discussed whether to pursue contact with their birth mother, weighing the potential for closure against the risk of disruption and rejection. The conversation revealed their different perspectives. Michael, raised with security and confidence, was eager to reach out to complete the picture of their origins. Samuel, scarred by years of abandonment and disappointment, felt more cautious, protective of the fragile equilibrium he had finally achieved in his life. They agreed to think about it separately and discuss again, to make no hasty decisions that might have lasting consequences. That weekend marked a shift in their relationship, deepening the connection beyond initial curiosity into something more substantial and enduring. Michael met Samuel's few friends, colleagues from freelance projects and acquaintances from the neighborhood, and Samuel was struck by how easily his brother navigated social situations, how naturally he put others at ease. He recognized the difference between them, the way their separate upbringings had shaped distinct personalities despite identical genetics. Michael had learned confidence and trust because the world had given him reasons to believe in stability. Samuel had learned caution and self-reliance because the world had taught him that nothing was guaranteed. Yet beneath these differences, they recognized fundamental similarities, core aspects of temperament and perception that seemed to exist independent of experience. They were both intense observers, both drawn to complexity and nuance, both prone to overthinking and analysis. They shared a sense of humor that was slightly dark and self-deprecating, a way of processing difficulty through ironic distance. These commonalities felt like bedrock, evidence of something essential that no amount of environmental variation could erase. As spring turned to summer, Samuel found his life gradually transforming in ways both subtle and profound. The presence of Michael, even at a distance, connected primarily through phone calls and occasional visits, provided a sense of anchoring he had never experienced before. The hollowness that had defined his existence for 25 years began to fill with something he could only identify as belonging. He had a brother. He had family. The words felt strange in his mouth, unfamiliar after a lifetime of claiming independence and self-sufficiency. But the strangeness was accompanied by relief, as though he had been holding his breath for decades and could finally exhale. Michael invited Samuel to Savannah for a long weekend, wanting to introduce him to his adoptive parents and to Claire, his fiancée. The prospect terrified Samuel in ways he struggled to articulate. Meeting Michael had been overwhelming enough. Encountering the family structures that had shaped his brother felt like stepping into an entirely foreign world. But he agreed, recognizing that this was part of accepting the relationship, part of allowing himself to be woven into the fabric of Michael's life. He drove to Savannah on a Friday afternoon in late June, following directions to a neighborhood of gracious homes with wide porches and ancient live oaks creating canopies of shade over quiet streets. Robert and Linda Bennett welcomed Samuel with warmth that seemed both genuine and tinged with sadness. He saw in their eyes the awareness of what his presence represented, the acknowledgement that their beloved son had been part of a pair, that somewhere in the parallel universe of possibility they might have adopted both children or neither. They had prepared dinner, an elaborate meal that Linda had clearly spent considerable effort creating, and they sat around the dining table as evening light slanted through the windows, asking Samuel careful questions about his life and listening with attentive compassion. Robert spoke about the adoption process, about their years of trying unsuccessfully to conceive, about the joy Michael had brought into their lives. Linda asked about Samuel's work, his interests, his hopes for the future, questions that probed gently without demanding more vulnerability than he was prepared to offer. Claire joined them later, arriving from a friend's house with easy confidence and greeting Samuel with a hug that surprised him with its unguarded affection. She was vibrant and articulate, a middle school English teacher with strong opinions and infectious laughter. She told stories about her first meeting with Michael, about their courtship, and the proposal that had come during a camping trip in the mountains. Samuel watched the way she and Michael interacted, the casual intimacy of long-established partnership, the shared language of inside jokes and meaningful glances. He felt a pang of envy, so sharp it almost resembled physical pain. Not because he wanted Claire specifically, but because he wanted what they represented, the possibility of deep connection, the experience of being truly known by another person, the security of reciprocal commitment. That night, after the Bennetts had gone to bed and Claire had departed, Samuel and Michael sat on the back porch with bottles of beer, listening to the cicadas and the distant sound of someone's television through an open window. The conversation meandered through topics both serious and mundane, eventually arriving at the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. Michael asked if Samuel had ever been in a serious relationship, and Samuel found himself answering with unusual honesty. He described a few brief attempts at romance in his early 20s, connections that had dissolved when he proved unable or unwilling to lower his defenses sufficiently for genuine intimacy. He acknowledged the pattern he had developed, maintaining distance, sabotaging potential closeness before it could threaten his carefully constructed independence. Michael listened without judgment, then shared his own struggles with relationship despite his more secure foundation. He described periods of depression in college, times when the persistent sense of incompleteness had manifested as paralyzing anxiety and withdrawal. He had sought therapy, worked through issues of identity and adoption trauma, eventually arriving at a place of greater stability. But the feeling had never entirely disappeared, he admitted, until the phone call from Dr. Henderson had recontextualized everything. Finding Samuel had answered questions Michael hadn't known how to ask, had filled spaces he hadn't realized were empty. He looked at Samuel with eyes that reflected the porch light and said quietly, "I think we were looking for each other our whole lives without knowing it. I think that's why nothing ever felt quite right." The words settled between them with the weight of truth, and Samuel felt tears gathering despite his habitual resistance to emotional display. He nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat, and Michael reached across the space, separating their chairs, to grip his shoulder. A gesture of solidarity and understanding that required no words. They sat in silence for a while, two halves of an equation finally balanced, two trajectories finally converging. Samuel realized that he had spent his entire life believing he was fundamentally broken, that the absence he carried was a personal failing rather than the consequence of separation. Now he understood differently. He had not been broken, he had been incomplete, and now, impossibly, miraculously, he was whole. The decision to search for their birth mother came gradually, emerging from conversations that circled the topic with increasing intensity. Samuel's initial resistance softened as Michael's enthusiasm remained steady and patient. They hired a private investigator who specialized in adoption searches, providing what information they had: the name on the original surrender documents, the city and date of their birth, the agency that had facilitated the process. The investigator worked efficiently, returning within 3 weeks with a current address and phone number. Their birth mother's name was Jennifer Morrison, now Jennifer Caldwell after marriage. She lived in Athens, Georgia, working as a nurse at a regional hospital, married with 2 other children. Half-siblings Samuel and Michael had never known existed. The investigator offered to make initial contact, to inform Jennifer of her son's desire to meet her and gauge her receptiveness. Samuel and Michael agreed, recognizing that this approach provided protection for all parties, allowing Jennifer to refuse contact if she chose, giving her time to process the information without the pressure of direct confrontation. The waiting period was excruciating, each day stretching with unbearable slowness as they imagined scenarios ranging from joyful reunion to complete rejection. When the investigator called with the response, Samuel was at work, struggling to focus on a logo design that seemed absurdly trivial compared to the weight of what he was waiting to hear. Jennifer had agreed to meet them. She had cried when the investigator reached her, had said she had thought about them every day for 25 years, had wondered if they were happy, if they were safe, if they blamed her for the choices she had made. She wanted to see them, to explain the circumstances that had led to their separation, to ask their forgiveness if they were willing to give it. The investigator relayed this information with professional neutrality, but Samuel heard the emotion beneath the words, understood that this was a reunion freighted with decades of grief and guilt and unanswered questions. He called Michael immediately after hanging up, his voice shaking as he delivered the news. They made plans to drive to Athens together to meet the woman who had given them life and then given them away. The meeting was arranged for a Saturday afternoon at a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of Athens, neutral territory where they could talk without interruption. Samuel and Michael drove together from Atlanta, the 90-minute trip passing in near silence as they both processed the magnitude of what was about to occur. Samuel felt nauseous with anxiety, his mind constructing and deconstructing possible conversations, trying to prepare for emotions he couldn't predict or control. Michael seemed calmer outwardly, but Samuel noticed the way his brother's hands gripped the steering wheel, the tension in his jaw that betrayed his own nervousness. They arrived early and sat in the parking lot, watching the entrance, waiting. She appeared at exactly 3 o'clock, a small woman with dark hair beginning to grey, wearing jeans and a simple blouse, her face lined with the evidence of years and stress and probably sleepless nights. Samuel recognized something in her features, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her chin, genetics asserting themselves across time and separation. She stood in the parking lot, looking uncertain, searching the scattered vehicles, and then Michael got out of the car, and she saw him, and her hand flew to her mouth, and she made a sound that was somewhere between laughter and sobbing. Samuel followed, moving on legs that felt unstable, and Jennifer looked from one to the other of them with an expression of wonder and devastation. They stood in awkward configuration for several seconds before Jennifer stepped forward and embraced Michael, then Samuel, her arms around each of them in turn, her body shaking with the force of her emotion. She smelled like lavender and something medicinal, probably from her work at the hospital. When she pulled back, her face was wet with tears, and she kept looking between them as though confirming their reality, as though afraid they might disappear if she looked away. They moved inside the restaurant, ordered food none of them would eat, and began the impossible conversation. Jennifer spoke first, her voice rough with crying, telling them the story of their birth and the circumstances that had led to their separation. She had been 17, pregnant by a boyfriend who had abandoned her when she refused to terminate the pregnancy. Her own parents had been religious and unforgiving, had thrown her out when her condition became visible. She had lived in a shelter for unwed mothers, terrified and alone, believing she would keep the babies despite having no resources or support. But when they were born, too tiny, perfect boys who deserved better than what she could provide, she had made the decision to surrender them, believing it was the only way to give them a chance at decent lives. The months following their meeting with Jennifer transformed Samuel's understanding of his own narrative, rewriting the story he had told himself about origin and abandonment and worth. Jennifer had not given them away out of indifference or cruelty. She had made an impossible choice, motivated by love and desperation, trying to provide for them in the only way available to her. She had carried the grief and guilt for 25 years, never expecting the possibility of reunion, never imagining that the blood she had given them might someday bring them back to her. The knowledge didn't erase Samuel's pain or make his childhood easier in retrospect, but it provided context that allowed him to reframe his history with something approaching compassion. They established a tentative relationship with Jennifer, cautious steps toward connection that respected everyone's boundaries and needs. She introduced them to her husband, David, a kind man who worked in construction and accepted Samuel and Michael with generous openness. They met their half-siblings, Emma, 16, and Daniel, 13, who regarded their suddenly appeared older brothers with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Family dinners became occasional events, awkward at first, but gradually settling into something that resembled normalcy. Samuel watched Michael navigate these gatherings with his characteristic ease, engaging with Emma about her ambitions to study veterinary medicine, playing video games with Daniel, helping David with a deck renovation project. He tried to participate, but often found himself overwhelmed, retreating to observation rather than engagement. Claire and Michael's wedding took place in October, a ceremony held in a garden in Savannah, with autumn light filtering through the trees and a gathering of friends and family that included Robert and Linda, Jennifer and David, and the half-siblings who served as junior attendants. Samuel stood as Michael's best man, delivering a speech that he had labored over for weeks, trying to articulate what it meant to discover a brother at 25. To have the architecture of loneliness suddenly reconstructed around connection. He spoke about the blood drive that had changed everything, about the miracle of genetic databases and medical technology that had made their reunion possible. He spoke about Michael's generosity and patience in welcoming him into an established life, about Claire's warmth in accepting another complicated piece into the family puzzle. His voice broke several times during the speech, emotion overwhelming his practiced control. But he finished, and the gathered guests responded with applause that felt like affirmation and acceptance. At the reception, Samuel danced with Jennifer to a slow song, her head barely reaching his shoulder, her hand small in his. She spoke quietly about her hopes for him, about wanting him to find the happiness that Michael had found, about believing that he deserved love and partnership despite the difficult beginning he had endured. Samuel didn't know how to respond, couldn't articulate the complex tangle of emotions he felt toward this woman who was simultaneously a stranger and the source of his existence. But he held her carefully as they moved across the floor, and when the song ended, he kissed her forehead in a gesture that surprised them both with its tenderness. Later that evening, Samuel sat on the edge of the garden with a glass of champagne, watching the celebration continue without him. Michael found him there, still in his wedding suit, but with his tie loosened and his hair disheveled from dancing. He sat down beside Samuel without speaking, and they remained in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the music and laughter drifting from the pavilion. Finally, Michael turned to him and said, "I always felt like something was missing. Now I know it was you." Samuel looked at his brother, his twin, his mirror, his other half, and felt the truth of those words settle deep within him. He had spent 25 years building a life around absence, constructing identity from the fragments of a fractured origin. Now, impossibly, the missing piece had been restored. Samuel thought about the blood drive, about the routine act of generosity that had become the catalyst for transformation. He thought about the invisible threads that connected people across time and distance. Genetics, circumstance, choice, and chance all weaving together to create the tapestry of relationship. He thought about the woman who had given them life and then given them away, carrying the weight of that decision through decades of uncertainty. He thought about Robert and Linda, who had loved Michael into wholeness, and about the foster families who had failed to do the same for him. He thought about all the variables that might have prevented this reunion, all the ways the story could have remained fractured and incomplete. But somehow, against all probability, they had found each other. Blood had called to blood across the miles and years, and the circle that had been broken at birth had been made whole again. Samuel reached over and gripped Michael's shoulder, the same gesture his brother had offered on that porch in Savannah months earlier. He didn't need to speak. Everything essential had already been said in the accumulation of conversations and shared silences that had brought them to this moment. They sat together as the celebration continued around them, two halves of an equation finally balanced. Two souls who had wandered separately through the world until genetics and chance and a simple act of generosity had revealed the truth. They had never been meant to be alone.